During part one of our investigation into the recent diplomatic crisis in the Andean region of South America, I think it was fairly clearly established that the entire Latin American community denigrated the activity as a violation of international law, and that everyone was quite upset about it. Colombia's response, incidentally, and because Colombia again gets $600 billion worth of military aid from the United States, can be much more brazen in its responses than other countries possibly might have the wherewithal to be. Was incredibly antagonistic at first. Alvaro Uribe said that he threatened the president of Colombia. Said that he was going to bring Venezuela before the International Criminal Court for funding terrorism and genocide. Now, and eventually he was convinced not to do so by his advisors, primarily for the reason that if any country in the region were to go before the International Criminal Court and be easily found guilty, it would be Colombia, whose intensive governmental ties to paramilitary organizations that have engaged in systematic terror across the entire country are well established. The fact that more trade unionists were killed in the nation of Colombia than all other nations in the world combined in the year 2006 and also during the 1990s is also well established. It's well established that the Colombian government has the worst human rights record in the hemisphere by agencies such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, etc. So he was definitely convinced not to do so very quickly by his advisors. And it's also important to note that even if he had brought the nation of Venezuela before the ICC, that would have been anti-legal in a sense, because when Colombia ratified the ICC, it declared a 7-year period of exemption for war crimes for itself. So it would be almost technically legally impossible for them to for someone to be exposed to justice paradigms that they themselves have said that they are not privy to being exposed to. As Alberto Rojas, a retired general of Venezuela, put it plainly, the only foreign government that finances the conflict in Colombia is the United States. And I'll get into that because the government of Colombia claimed that it found several laptop computers and notes that somehow magically survived an intense carpet cluster bombing, and also troops, pouring in and firing ammunition into the camp. Somehow these survived, and supposedly put forth evidence that was completely irrefutable that Venezuela had been financing the FARC in the Colombian region. But as Greg Palast has, I think, easily refuted, says that they don't say anything of the sort, and I'll get into that momentarily. I'll have to find that piece of paper. I don't know where it is at the moment. But John Lindsay Poland of FPIF.org, Foreign Policy in Focus, he also noticed that he was one of the first people, along with Justin Poder and my personal good friend Michael O. Tuatale. Man, I can't pronounce your last name, but your articles are great. I hope you're being very careful down there in Colombia right now. He is on location, has been writing about this crisis as it happened for UpsideDownWorld.org. But a lot of these people jumped right on it and were very easily able to connect the United States possibly to the activities. For instance, as I said, John Lindsay Poland said Ecuadorian groups have called for an investigation into the role the U.S. base in Manta, the Ecuadorian territory of Manta, might have played due to AWACS aircraft that are stationed at the base, because AWACS aircraft happen to possess the technology to intercept satellite phone transmissions. What it really comes down to is the United States and Colombia have no interest in there being a diplomatic solution to the FARC versus the Colombian government conflict, and also the paramilitary associations associated and interrelated with the government of Colombia, also their reign of terror. I don't think they want diplomatic solutions to this, even though many international statesmen, including Hugo Chavez, like I said, who between him and Colombian Senator Cordoba were doing a fantastic job of engaging in humanitarian concessions in order for the FARC to be recognized as a belligerent force, which simply means that they'll have to abide by the Geneva Conventions and the regular norms of war as though they were a country. It simply recognizes that they are a legitimate force that opposes what is a corrupt regime in Colombia. And they're not the only people to think that. U.S. Attorney Paul Wolf, Mexican Deputy Ricardo Garza, and a lot of other international statesmen all across the world, in Europe, South America, Africa, Asia, etc. They call for the international recognition, primarily for the reason that there's no international law against having a revolution. And they want the FARC to be recognized because it's a concession that you can give, and then the FARC can release some of their hostages, including 3 Americans and Ingrid Betancourt, a former French candidate for president. And they've held a lot of these hostages for years, so it's come to a point where we have to legitimately recognize they're fighting a corrupt government and give some concessions to get those hostages back. Let's see, got some organizing here to do on the index cards, and they're pretty much just saying what I just said about the having to recognize the FARC, the belligerent status of the FARC, which I think it's also important to note that Chavez and nobody sane would say that just because you recognize the fact that they are a belligerent force fighting against Colombia, that you also endorse the heinous crimes that they've engaged in. And in actuality, by giving them that recognition, it does, like I said, force them to abide by international norms. If you want them to continue to engage in savagery, you won't give them this recognition, so they have no choice and no scope of punishment, from international sectors. It's also important to note, I think, that while the United States desires to paint the FARC as some kind of international terrorist agent and engaged in international terrorist activity, they don't do anything of the sort. All of their activity has been exclusively enclosed within Colombian borders for the most part, with the exception of retreating to Ecuador, having these little camps set up. Though they're not, and they don't engage in terrorism against Ecuador or Venezuela, and the Ecuadorian and Venezuelan governments don't support these camps. Robert Naiman, just like I said, Robert Naiman of Just Foreign Policy stated that the attack was part of a pattern. You can look into his writings to see more of the pattern of Colombian government, and that any successful diplomacy with the FARC, any successful diplomacy had to be met with military activity. Justin Poder suspected that the entire ordeal was engineered just to escalate into a regional conflict that could only benefit the U.S. and only savagely, be detrimental to the inhabitants of Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador, and it would be particularly catastrophic and cataclysmic for the Bolivarian revolution that's currently underway in Venezuela. Otuatel, and again, I apologize if you get the name wrong, stresses that the only country that stood to gain if the conflict, again, in line with Justin Poder and my thinking, escalated into war would have been the U.S. because they, in addition to funding Colombia, one of the last stalwart allies that we have in the region, they have engaged in systematic funding of opposition groups in Venezuela, as I documented in my videos on the National Endowment for Democracy, as well as having actively participated in a coup in 2002, and tacitly mentioned that Venezuela needs to get in line after the coup. We'll talk a little bit more about the responses of the United States, including the responses of all the presidential candidates within the confines of Part 3.